Good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in to my channel and checking out my video. Today's video is going to be about my personal experience with getting into CB radio as a hobby. Now, I'm not going to try to come off as an expert as far as everything related to CB radio and ham radio, but I will cover the things that I think aren't always talked about. Some of my own ideas. Anyway, that's my intro. So here we go. Okay, so to begin with, this is a radio I bought about 3 years ago, and it's the cheapest one you can buy. And before I bought it, I went down to a local electronics repair shop and CB radio shop, and I first got some advice there, and I learned a lot because there was actually a trucker that was in at the same time, and they were more than happy that I was learning about CB and asking questions. So I got to listen to their conversation. And I won't recap that, but that's kind of where I first got an introduction to CB radio. And as much as I appreciated the advice that I got in this particular repair shop, I didn't actually want to buy a radio from them because they were charging a whole lot more. And I knew I could just buy something cheap and introductory on Amazon. So I did that. Again, this is about 3 years ago. And this is the radio I bought. It's the cheapest one you can get. It has no scan feature, and in fact there are very few features at all. And what you see is what you get. A volume, a squelch, and channel selection, channel 9, if you want to go talk to truckers, and then a very nice but simple handheld mic, and then you've got the option to have a PA hooked into the back. So this is the simplest type of CB you could buy. And as you can see on this very popular online website, which is probably the most popular one you can think of, they also offered like this package with this K40 antenna and the cigarette lighter adapter. So I actually bought this package, and I also bought the Astatic SWR meter, which was very affordable. So I think for like under $200 Canadian, I ended up getting into the hobby of CB radio, and I did it by buying mobile equipment. Now, when I bought this kit and this particular antenna, it was very easy to set up, and I hooked it up in the car. But one of the problems is that when I started flipping around the channels, there was nothing to listen to, and there were only a few people to talk to. So I thought, well, what is it? Is it my antenna that doesn't have great reception range? Well, that's maybe part of it. But the other part is that people just aren't using CB radio like they were years ago. So that's the point I'm arriving at in my video, is that people really don't use CB radio as much to talk, at least in southern Ontario where I am. So what is the incentive to get into this hobby? Now, there are people talking at certain times, and there's always lots of activity on channel 38, channel 39, on sideband, which is a whole different discussion. But obviously this radio is not sideband, so you're not able to access those conversations on channel 38, 39. So why get into this hobby? I will try to explain my thoughts on this. here's why, even though CB radio is not as popular these days, here's why I'm still fascinated by the hobby. First of all, if somebody's talking on CB, chances are they are looking to talk to other people. They are actively trying to have a conversation with other people. So rest assured that, if you're talking to someone, they probably want to talk to you. So that's kind of reassuring. Yes, you can have cell phones these days, you can have internet communication, but there is something that CB still offers where you can talk to anybody at any time. It doesn't have to be formal or face-to-face, and you're probably assured that if you're talking to somebody who wants to talk, and they're actively looking to just have a conversation. And also, usually it's men. Usually guys get into this hobby. So really, you want to talk about guy stuff? Well, that's what CB radio is all about. You want to talk about cars, traffic, whatever, guy stuff. There's always a conversation going on if there is a conversation happening. But in short, I've had this radio for 3 years. It works pretty well. It's been reliable. But I have yet to have really great conversations on it. I can get radio checks. I can hear other tow truck operators talking about things, but I've still yet to have really great contacts while I'm out in my car driving places. It doesn't really happen, and maybe that's just my experience. Now, given that conversation is somewhat limited, the next question to ask is, what's the incentive to spend more money on equipment to, say, maybe set up a base station in your home and sink more money into the hobby if what's already available as far as conversations and being able to talk to other people is already limited? What's the incentive to really dive into this hobby with 2 feet and spend a whole lot of money on equipment? And this is one of the problems I really face in CB radio, because for years I've been contemplating setting up a base station and paying for all the equipment, and then when I kind of crunch the numbers as to how expensive it's going to be, I back out and decide, you know what, it's not really worth the expense. I'm willing to put in the effort to put up antennas and run lines and run grounding wires. I'm willing to do that, but for what? Who's out there to talk to? This is really the problem I face in this hobby. Okay, so I am going to try and get some numbers on the screen and some different equipment just to show roughly what it would cost to set up a CB radio base station in your home. I mean, you can set up a mobile rig in your truck or car for between $200 and $300, maybe $400. But what would it cost if you want to really have a good rig in your house? I'm going to get to that in a minute. But if somebody new to the hobby came and asked me and said, I'm thinking about getting into CB radio or even ham radio, what should I consider buying first? What kind of equipment should I consider looking at? Well, it's probably good to look at local online classifieds, because you might find somebody who's selling all of their old CB equipment and you might manage to find a deal. But a good way to test out and try out the hobby is to see if you can find an old radio scanner that someone has for sale on Kijiji or Craigslist, and then just have a listen to the different ham bands or CB radio bands, just to see if you enjoy or like listening to the conversations that are being had, and whether you think that that's something you'd like to get involved in. This is kind of what I did years before I really even got into CB radio. Back in 2004, I had a Radio Shack Pro 2006 radio scanner. Just trying to see if it's coming up on the list here. Here's a picture of one here. And this is a cheap way to get into the hobby, to test it out and see if you're interested in ham or CB. Because myself, for 60 bucks, going back 3 years, I bought myself a Uniden BCT8, and then in my free time I set up a quarter wave antenna which I built myself and mounted on my roof, and it looks a lot like this one, and it works pretty well. The only problem with, say, like a quarter wave antenna is that you'll have a very difficult time listening to CB radio, because the actual sine wave frequency, which is transmitted and received on CB radio, is a very long length, and a small quarter wave antenna just might not do it. You actually need a very long 102-inch CB radio whip antenna to properly listen to CB channels, which is in the 25 to 30 megahertz range, on a radio scanner. So I'm going to repeat that. If you want to listen to CB radio conversations on your radio scanner, you might get a few local conversations on your radio scanner if you're using just a regular ordinary antenna, and you'll probably be able to get skip CB, which is like the really high-powered CB radio guys in the States when they're running huge, expensive, high wattage rigs. You might be able to pick that up on your scanner, but you really won't access much of what's available on CB radio until you actually hook up a CB radio antenna to your radio scanner. It's got to be about a 102-inch long whip antenna, or one of the shorter fiberglass CB radio sticks probably would work too. But this is something to consider. If you're listening to a radio scanner for CB radio, you're not going to have very much success. You'll have limited success, so keep that in mind. This is something I don't think that is covered a lot in CB radio vids. But if someone came to me as a beginner who was new to the radio hobby, and they said, I want to get into it, I would say, well, a good way to get into it is to get yourself an old radio scanner that somebody is selling, hook up a quarter wave antenna as best you can. You don't even have to build one of these. You could probably just hang up a similarly lengthened wire, and even experiment with banana clips and hook that up to the back end of a radio scanner. And for like $60 you can listen to the different ham and CB bands, and then just decide whether or not this is the hobby for you. Okay, so I drew this up on the Paint program, and I tried to come up with a package that maybe you would buy for brand new equipment if you were going to set up a decent base station. Now, this is not like introductory and beginner equipment, because I think the cheapest thing you could buy is some mobile equipment, as I mentioned already, which might cost you anywhere from $200 to $400. But if you want to upgrade and maybe talk on sideband, which seems kind of more of a base station type of thing, not exclusively. You could run sideband in your mobile rig, but it tends to be that a lot of old base stations always had sideband on them, And when people want to set up a really good setup at home for a base station, they tend to opt for a radio with sideband. And that's probably going to cost at least $100 more for a radio with sideband. Why that's such an expensive feature in a radio as far as electronic components goes, I've yet to study and understand that better. But anyway, that seems to be the way it goes. So I was looking at a sideband radio for myself because I'm looking at putting up a base station in my home. So I was looking at the Galaxy 959 with the megahertz display readout, which was about $280 Canadian, and then there's a very similar Uniden 980, which has sideband as well with the readout. So that's pretty much the price of a radio with sideband. I haven't exhaustively studied all the different radios available, but if you want sideband, you're probably going to spend this much Canadian. Okay, then if you want like one of the most popular base station antennas that seem to be available, the Antron or Solarcon A99 antenna seems to be popular. That doesn't seem completely out of price range, $137. That's fairly affordable, I guess. But then you're also going to have some cabling, which will cost you $50, and a power supply. This is kind of on the higher end of power supplies because this is 30 amps. That's much higher than you need. I've seen people run base stations on YouTube with like 3 amp power supplies. So this is probably twice as much as you have to pay. You can probably get a power supply for a little more than half that. And I guess running barefoot, they call it, without running a linear amp is possible. But if you're going to set up a decent base station, I think you probably want to amplify it. So a linear amplifier, this one has a preamp, but that's going to cost you about $100 as well. Not to mention, if you're going to buy this antenna, you're probably going to have to spend at least $50 to $100 getting some kind of antenna mast set up on your home. Even if you're just running something on your roof, you still might need some type of bracket. So it might be in this price range. Well, anyway, that's all things said. It's going to cost about $720 before provincial sales tax. Talking about Ontario, it's going to cost about this much just to get into the hobby in your home. And with sales tax, that's about $820 Canadian. And things always seem to be cheaper in the States, so that's probably about $550 US. So, having said all of that, this is really what prevents me from further getting into CB as a more serious hobby is the expense of it. Every time I consider buying all of this equipment, then I always stop and think about how much CB traffic is even available whenever I turn my CB radio on. And $820 plus the effort it would take to set up all this equipment, which is not impossible, it's probably an afternoon, just doesn't seem worth it considering the expense. And this is really what's preventing me from diving in to the hobby and buying all the equipment and setting it up at home. I still am pursuing CB, and this is probably what I'm going to do within coming months because the spring is here, so I am probably going to try to set some type of base station up. But this is really where I get hung up, is the cost of getting into this hobby. Now, maybe people can share their comments and challenge what I'm about to say, but it goes a little like this. I used to work in electronics manufacturing. I did it as a career, and I worked in circuit board printing. at a mid-sized company that employed maybe 250 people, not too far from where I live. And so I know how cheap electronics can be printed out. And CB radios have been around since the 70s, and they can sell for as little as $40 or $50 for the cheapest base model CB. So I find it a little bit hard to believe that they should even run up into this range. I think that maybe a CB should be possible to manufacture for much cheaper than what they're actually going for. This is not new technology. My real fear getting into this hobby a step further by buying all this equipment and setting up a base station is that I'll spend $820 and it'll all be set up. I'll have very little traffic on my CB and few conversations to have, and I'll feel like I've wasted almost $1,000. So, at the moment, what I'm actually considering doing is almost like my quarter wave antenna, which I've been using to listen in to ham radio. I'm considering actually building my own CB radio antenna. And then I'm going to hook it up to this cheap CB radio I already have. And I'm going to test out kind of like a homemade base station, homemade antenna, just to see what kind of reception I get. And only then will I proceed into purchasing a whole rig for myself. So I haven't created this video to come off as an expert. In fact, I probably still am somewhat of an amateur. So I'm just sharing my thoughts, and I'm interested to hear what other people have to say. Another thing I've considered and measured against getting a more expensive rig going for myself is to actually just skip CB radio altogether and go get the ham radio license, because there are more people talking on ham radio, and I can attest that having listened to my radio scanner. The only problem with getting into ham is obviously there's a license required. The equipment is as expensive, if not more expensive, than CB radio. And the course offered in my area, I guess you can just go take the test, but the local radio club is offering 16 sessions of in-class training, and I don't have time for that. And that's no disrespect to hams, but this to me is really the barrier of getting into the hobby. Again, I go to the local club which is offering the course on taking the ham radio license, and there's 16 sessions, 16 classroom sessions. So there's a time commitment to getting the ham license just to be able to talk on ham radio. So my next project is to try and build myself a homemade 102-inch CB radio. And I went out to the hardware store today actually, and I bought a bare copper wire, 15 meters of it, for only $20 before tax. And this seems like a good way to get into it. I'm not going to say that the CB antenna I make will be the best quality, but for $20 as compared to a brand new Antron 99 antenna, I can build something cheap and not be afraid to modify it or cut it or even start from scratch and build a brand new one. And here's kind of a question that I have which remains unanswered, so if you're listening and you have some advice for me, I'd love to hear it. But all of these manufactured CB antennas which you can buy, how are they different from, say, a stainless steel rod or a steel rod that you can buy in a department store? I mean, what makes these antennas more effective as conduits? I'm saying, how is this any better than just like a metal rod that you can mount in your backyard? I mean, are the raw materials and alloys that go into the CB antenna superior in these antennas? I mean, what makes them worth $200 and upwards? I don't completely understand this. So in closing, I guess I'm showing my ignorance when it comes to CB radio antenna design. But I'd really love a good explanation as to why these antennas are better than just a metal rod that you can purchase from the store and clip down. Granted, they have this inductor style featured in the antenna where you've got a coil or a choke, and I guess the flexible magnet. Granted, but I'm just trying to understand why some of these antennas are just so expensive.